Good morning, everybody. My name's Karen Robinson. I'm happy to welcome you to the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis seminars. For those of you who don't know, the seminars are once a month on the first Thursday. And also, if you don't know, the list of the seminars and also the slides and the audio for the seminars are on the CCTES website. So if you missed something that Dr. Lauer says today, you can go and listen to it later, or you can check out somebody who was here earlier this year, or last year, or the year before. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lauer. Dr. Michael Lauer is the Deputy Director for Extramural Research at NIH. He went to RPI, Harvard School of Medicine, School of Public Health, and worked with the NHLBI's Framingham Heart Study. And as many of you know, he was at the NHLBI until 2015 as the division director. And it's very timely that he's here. There was an email sent out about what he's going to say is not a new definition of clinical trials and human subjects research, and we're happy to welcome you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. All right, so this is a seminar, and so please, so because it's a seminar, maybe I'll take off my jacket. No, it's okay. I'll leave it on because of the microphone. Anyway, please feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, and you know, we can talk about anything. So I've been asked to talk about some clinical trial reforms that are going on at NIH, why we're doing this, what exactly is involved, and how it's going to happen. And I want to start by telling you a story. This goes back to January of 2012. So at that time, there was a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal about non-publication of NIH-funded clinical trials. I'm just curious, how many of you have seen this? Okay, so some of you have and some of you haven't. So this was led by Joe Ross and Harlan Krumholtz at Yale and Deborah Zarin at the National Library of Medicine. What they did was they looked at just over 600 NIH-funded trials that were registered in clinicaltrials.gov and that, as best as they could tell, were completed. And then they looked to see how long after the completion date was it until the main results of those trials were published. So if you look here, on the x-axis is the time from study completion. So 0 means the study is done, you've locked down your data set, theoretically you could publish the results tomorrow. And then the y-axis is the percentage of studies in which the main results were published. And so on the x-axis here we go 20 months, 40 months, 60 months, 80 months, 100 months. And after 30 months is 2.5 years. That's a long time. So after 30 months, only about half, or actually less than half, of the trials had their main results published. So the authors expressed some alarm about this, and they noted that the FDA Amendments Act had been passed a few years before. One of the purposes of the FDA Amendments Act was to reduce or potentially eliminate underreporting of clinical trial results. And here we have a large body of trials that are not having their results reported either at all or in a timely way. And so they pointed out that there are many NIH-funded trials that are not covered by the FDA Amendments Act because many of the trials that we fund, in fact, probably most of the trials that we fund, do not cover FDA-regulated products. And they particularly pointed out trials of behavioral interventions and surgical procedures. And then they said no policies exist to make sure that the public has access to results from NIH-funded research that is not published. So basically what they were saying was that the way our system was set up, if the authors of a study did not publish the results of their trial, the public had no recourse. Okay, so this paper comes out in January of 2012, and it creates a lot of excitement. There are news stories and radio reports. There are letters from Congress that start with the phrase, "We are writing to express our concern." You never like to get a letter that says, "We are writing to express our concern." And also I was getting phone calls from some of my former colleagues at Cleveland Clinic and elsewhere, and they were wondering, what the heck were we doing? How could we be asleep at the wheel and allow half of the clinical trials that we fund to not get published? So our reaction to this was that it was wrong. Was just complete disbelief. We could not understand how it would be possible that an academic would get NIH money and not publish their results. Since publication is the currency of promotion in academia, how is it possible that they would not publish their results? And how is it not possible that they would not publish their results quickly? And so we decided that we were going to do everything that we needed to do to prove that this was wrong. We thought that we found some what we thought were methodological flaws. The time window was too narrow. They didn't verify non-publication. And so we decided that we were going to do the study right. So what we did was we identified 244 consecutive cardiovascular trials that NHLBI had funded and that had been completed over a long period of time, over about 10 years. They were registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And if we couldn't find the publication, we would contact the PI and say, we can't find the paper. Could you please send it to us? So, effectively, this was brute force source data verification. So we did this study, and we found some results. And then what we did was we published those results in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2013. So I'm going to show you now what we found. I want to particularly call out, I had a lot of help on this, but I particularly want to call out David Gordon. Some of you may know, very experienced clinical trialist who was at NHLBI for a very long time, and also Peter Kaufman, who's a psychologist and a very experienced person in behavioral trials. Anyway, so what we did a very similar kind of study. So here on the x-axis is the number of months after the completion. Completion means the trial is done, the data set is locked, the results could be potentially published the very next day. And then the y-axis is the percentage of studies that were that had their main results published. Now then what we did was we divided our trials into two different types. One type would be trials that focus on hard clinical endpoints like death or heart attack or stroke or an unwanted hospitalization. And for those trials, this is what we saw. We saw that about 2/3 published within a year, and after 2 years, every single one of those trials had published. And our reaction to that was, well, yeah, everything's just fine. Of course, we're not seeing any kind of problem. But the problem was that they only represented a small minority of the trials. They were less than 20% of the trials. Over 80% of the trials that we funded did not focus on hard clinical endpoints. They focused on surrogate endpoints. And there we saw a very different picture. So there, after a year, maybe about 10% of those trials had published their results. And after about 30 months or 2.5 years, it was maybe about 50%. And so because these represented the vast majority of the trials that we funded, they pulled the average down. So in our effort to refute the BMJ paper, we effectively replicated it. So we used a very different method, and we also found that a large number of trials that we funded did not have their main results published, and this was particularly true for trials that focused on surrogate endpoints. So in our discussion, we said a number of parties share responsibility for this, including funders, investigators, academic medical centers, universities, clinical research organizations, and journals. Okay, so that comes out in November of 2013. The story continues. And so let's think here about academic medical centers. Last year, in 2016, Harlan Krumholtz and Joe Ross did another study. And this study involved a different set of trials than the trials they looked at before. They looked at about 4,000 trials that had been completed between 2007 and 2010. These were a mix of trials, so industry trials, NIH trials, foundation trials. And they wanted to see what proportion of those trials posted main results within 2 years. and their definition of posting main results would be either a paper that was published in a peer-reviewed journal or a posting of results on clinicaltrials.gov. Now, what they were particularly interested in were academic medical centers. They were interested in the top centers in the United States, and they wanted to see whether or not there were differences in the publication rates across different academic centers. And the thinking behind this is that there may be certain academic centers that are really excellent, that are publishing 80 to 90% of their studies, and let's find out what they're doing, and we could use that to help inform practice elsewhere. Okay, so here's what they found. So this, the x-axis refers to institutions. Now, I should have looked ahead of time where Hopkins is. Hopkins is here somewhere. There it is. There's Hopkins, right there. Johns Hopkins University is right there. The y-axis is the percentage of trials that were hosted at that institution, where that institution was the main center, that got published or posted within 2 years. So the winner is the University of Minnesota. I don't know if any of you are Minnesota alums. But their publication rate was 55%, so it was pretty poor. Most of these top centers here were running in the 30% range. So the authors write, despite the ethical mandate and expressed values of academic institutions, there is poor performance and noticeable variation in the dissemination of clinical trial results across leading academic medical centers. Okay, so this paper came out in February of 2016, and then very shortly thereafter, the lead author on this paper is Harlan Krumholtz, who many of you may know. Harlan posted a column on the NPR website, and on his column he said what he really thought about all this. So now I'm going to show you what he really thought about all this. He posted a piece called "Academic Medical Centers Get an F when it comes to sharing data research results." It says, "We have a bottleneck at our nation's bastions of research excellence. Too many times study results are neither reported on the government website, clinicaltrials.gov, nor published in a journal. The failure to share results is so pervasive that it seems inappropriate to blame individuals. Instead, it is a systemic problem." In fact, it's a problem that's been known about for a long time. It's a problem that's been known about for, as probably many of you know, for decades, many decades, that there is massive underreporting of research in general and clinical trials as well. So the point here is that this is not a matter of some bad apples or irresponsible people here and there. This is a systems issue. Okay, so then he goes on. "Not reporting results violates the basic principle of the scientific method. It hurts patient society and science. It dishonors the people who gave their consent and bore the risk of participating. The holding back of the results impedes progress towards scientific breakthroughs, corrupts the medical literature, and wastes research funding." Now, I put that one in bold, waste research funding, because we spend our day thinking about how we're allocating money. We have a limited amount of money. Unfortunately, we have far more outstanding science than we could potentially fund than we have money available. And so we do have a responsibility to make sure that every dollar that we send out is being sent out wisely. And in fact, when that initial report came out in 2012 about NIH trials not having their results published, many of the criticisms we heard, including from Congress, was, "It sounds like you guys are wasting money." Now, you may be familiar, there was a series of articles that appeared in Lancet, I think back in 2014, about poor oversight of research funding. There was a whole series of articles. This article was led by Malcolm McLeod. Biomedical research, increasing value and reducing waste. And they present, you might call it the physiology of waste in research. So first is that the questions that are being asked are low priority questions. The second is that the methods are no good. The third is that the regulation is either absent when it should be present, or ineffective when it is present, or excessively burdensome. Information, which we'll get to in a second, and then reports that even when the results of studies are released, the reports themselves are not all that helpful. They may not have the information that really needs to be there. they may not provide enough information about the methodology that was used to enable people to understand what's going on. And so I have this arrow there under information, and there they point out that more than 50% of studies are never fully reported, and this, and in particular, there's a biased underreporting of studies with disappointing results. So this is not a unique problem to clinical trials. This is something which is true across the entire research enterprise. You might say that with clinical trials, it's perhaps a little bit easier to get your arm around it for a couple of reasons. One is that a clinical trial, by definition, there's a preset protocol that exists somewhere. Somebody decided that they were going to do an experiment, and this is what the experiment was going to look like. And then the second is that it involves people. And so you might argue that the ethical obligation to people upon whom you're going to do an experiment is particularly acute and important. Okay, so then I want to thank Karen. She pointed out this article to me. It was a brief letter that appeared in Lancet just a few months ago entitled, "What Are Funders Doing to Minimize Waste in Research?" This was written by Mona Nasser from England. And what she did, she went through the websites of 11 major funders, including our website. And I have to say I'm very impressed that she spent some time scouring through our website, because our website is big. So she was looking for various items. And so she pointed out here that only 6 of the 11 funding agencies are explicit that they require publication of full reports of the research they have funded. No funder has a comprehensive strategy to make available full data sets of all research projects. And by the way, we're not even talking about that. And that's something that we can talk about, actually. That's something that we're very interested in, is making all data available. But we're not even talking about that. Right now, all we're talking about is just a summary of the main results of the trials. Thoughts about this? Yeah?
What does it mean, require publication? What will they do to you?
That's a great question. So what will they do to you? So they could say, well, we're very disappointed. And that only goes so far. So in order for a policy like this to have real teeth, there has to be some kind of a consequence. And so we have actually put into policy that we have now rolled out. We have a process in place to look for noncompliance, and that noncompliance meaning that results of trials are not being posted in a timely way. And we have now written into our policy that if an institution is out of compliance, we won't fund the next trial. Now, what we really hope will happen is that they'll post their results. At the institution, that's correct, because we don't fund, by the way, we don't fund individual scientists, we fund institutions. When we're dealing with Hopkins, we're dealing with Hopkins, we're not dealing with each of you. Yeah?
Well, I'm really happy that you're focusing on waste and that you're using that word, because at least in my experience after the 2014 papers, I found U.S. people were really offended by this idea of waste. Have you found this? Yeah,
people are really offended. The idea is this. It reminds me a little bit of, so when I was at Cleveland Clinic and back in the early 1990s, and we were getting into this issue about quality, and I remember one of my colleagues raised his hand and he basically said, "I'm offended by all this. Our quality is good. We do great work, and could you please leave us alone?" And we said, well, it doesn't quite work like that. We actually have to see. And what we actually see is that we got some real problems. One problem, of course, I'm pointing out right here is the non-publication of studies. Another big problem that we have is that we have what we think is an epidemic of underpowered studies, underpowered human studies and underpowered animal studies. And that may be a big reason why our reproducibility is so poor. And so yes, some people are offended by this, and I have to say, on the other hand, there are other folks and other stakeholders who are taking it all very seriously. I think one critical part to this is that it's not something that any one stakeholder, any one player can fix. And so it's not like we can push a button and just fix it. There has to be accountability, and that's one thing that's been missing. So we do have to have the policies, and we do have to have accountability. But then at the same time, what also has to happen is that other stakeholders have to play a role as well. And I have to say, I've been, in my work, I participate in areas of science that go way beyond clinical trials, and there's some very good things that are happening out there. Yeah.
So, as researchers, we're expected to go into, my NHLBI or my whatever it is, the National Library of Medicine, NLM, and set up my bibliography, especially if you're going to be applying for more funding, and then you are supposed to associate your grant numbers with individual publications. If one were to use that to study how many grants never end in a publication, do you know what they would find, or do people just not do that enough that you can rely on it?
Yeah, so we actually have looked at that. There are grants that do not publish any papers at all. And arguably, if a 5-year grant does not yield a single publication, that's a failure. You could have a publication that says, we did all this work and nothing worked. That's okay, but that's a publication. So we see a wide range. I don't remember what the aggregate number is, but there are some areas of science where the non-publication rate is as high as 20%. That 20% of grants are not publishing a single paper. Now, in the studies that some of my colleagues have been doing most of the work on this, when they find a grant where they find no publication, they look really hard to find one. And actually, we're now developing methods to try to find papers that are associated with grants where the grant number may not necessarily be there, or where the author may not have provided us with that information. So we're looking at, for example, similarity of text between what's in the paper and what's in the grant. And even when we do that, we are actually finding a small but nonetheless substantial number of grants where nothing is being published. Yeah?
Was there any of those analyses stratified by whether the trials were multi-center or the size of the trial?
Yes. So that's a really great question. So multi-center studies or trials that were more expensive, and our definition of more expensive was $5 million, which in the overall scheme of trials is pretty cheap. But when we looked at that, we found that multi-center trials and more expensive trials published much faster. Their non-publication rates were exceedingly low. So it seems like most of the problem are the studies that are at a single center and that are relatively inexpensive. Each individual study may not add up to that much money, but when you add it all up, in our case, the cohort that we looked at, it was something like $800 million for those kinds of studies. I mean, we know, I'm sure that this is probably true here, but there are places where you have a multi-center study going, the paper is basically written, the shell is already there, and so when the study is done, all the analysis code has been written, and so when the study is done, what the investigators do is and they're comfortable the data set is clean, they push the button, see what the results are, and then they have to revise things. But that may be more the exception than the rule. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Do you look at where people are publishing? Because we had Jeff Beal here a few weeks ago, and he said that one of the easiest way to get an editorial journal into something like NLM is to publish at least one study that's supported by the NIH.
So that's a very interesting topic about so-called predatory journals. And it's something that has our colleagues at NLM a bit upset. So yes, you're absolutely right. So what happens is that a predatory journal will find somebody who's funded by NIH, say, oh, we'll publish your paper, just send us $3,000, and we'll publish the paper. By the way, I heard one story, which is the authors pushed back and said $3,000 was too much, and so they said, okay, we'll take $1,500. And so then what happens is they publish the paper in the predatory journal, and then since we have a rule that says that all NIH-funded studies have to go to PubMed Central, then the paper gets published or posted in PubMed Central, which then gives an air of legitimacy to the predatory journal. So that is something that is a matter of concern. Now another issue here is that we actually got asked that question about where people are publishing. And so, for example, we did an analysis on that, which I think we posted in a letter. It was like one of the letters that we got, and then we posted that. And if I remember right, as you might expect, the articles that focused, or the studies that focused on hard clinical endpoints were published in places like New England and Lancet, and the articles that focused on surrogate endpoints appeared in places like JACC and the American Journal of Cardiology. And so actually one key point here is that if you're writing a study in which the primary endpoint is a surrogate endpoint, it's a relatively small trial, don't send it to the New England Journal. All you're going to do is lose time. And instead, aim for a journal that's more appropriate. Okay. All right. So that's problem number one. Problem number one is that we're funding studies and the results aren't coming out, or they're not coming out in a timely way. So here's problem number two. So we deal with an office called the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. And whenever we hear that GAO is interested in something that we're doing, that usually generates a need to take some Tums. And so they do, some of the stuff that they do is actually, some of it is mandated by law. And I have to say, I think this report was absolutely spot on, although the initial response to it was a little bit, we were a little nervous about it, but I think what they said was absolutely spot on. So the title says it all. Additional data would enhance the stewardship of clinical trials across the agency. NIH is the National Institutes of Health. The key word is institutes, and the key letter is the S at the end. We are a federation. We are a group of individual institutes. There are 27 institutes. That means that at any given time there are 54 opinions about the right way to do things. And these institutes are fiercely, they're very concerned about their autonomy and their independence. NIAID has a way of doing things. Cancer has a way of doing things. Heart, lung, and blood has a way of doing things. Diabetes has a way of doing things. And one of the problems that GAO noted was that as an agency, we didn't really have a good handle on the clinical trials that we were funding because we didn't have a certain body of metadata that covered all trials that we were looking at. And we had to admit that was true. In fact, we were asked the question, how many trials is NIH funding today that are actively enrolling patients? You think that would be really easy to answer, and that should be something where I could just sit in front of a computer, push a button, and within a few seconds get the answer, and we couldn't get the answer to that. Now, we could come up with an estimate, but we actually couldn't say, 3,256, and here's the list. So they say here, NIH OD, that's the Office of the Director, reviews some data on clinical trial activity across NIH, but has not finalized what additional data it needs or established a process for using these data to enhance its stewardship. NIH is limited in its ability to make data-driven decisions regarding the use of its roughly $3 billion annual investment in clinical trials. So that's problem number two. So problem number one is we don't know what's going out, and problem number two is we don't know what's going in. All right. So that came out in March of 2016, that GAO report, although we knew about it for at least, I think, a couple of years, that it was coming and that the GAO had some very serious concerns about what was going on. So a lot of people have been working on improving stewardship of clinical trials at NIH, and hundreds of people, and in a way my own role was fairly minor, but I'd like to, just a few headlines of what happened. Back in October of 2014, NIH put out its definition of a clinical trial. There are these rumors going around that there's a new definition of clinical trial. There's no new definition of clinical trial. That came out in October of 2014, and that was done not in isolation. That was done in coordination with the work that was being done to revise the Common Rule. So it was a trans HHS effort. My predecessor, Sally Rocky, posted a blog in November of 2014 in which she noted that NIH was issuing a proposed rule. The proposed rule essentially would say that every trial that NIH funds, irrespective of whether it's FDA regulated or not, would require registration, and that registration would have to occur within 21 days of the enrollment of the first patient, and also would require posting of results, main results, within 1 year of completion on clinicaltrials.gov. So that proposed rule was put out in November of 2014. It was over 3 years ago. Also at that time, to publicize the concern, Francis Collins and Kathy Hudson posted a piece in JAMA sharing and reporting the results of clinical trials. They talked about the concerns that they had, that so much money was being spent on trials that weren't seeing the light of day. And there were a lot of responses to this. So the proposed rule was out for public comment from November of 2014 through March of 2015. We received over 240 comments, including comments from individuals, from institutions, from professional societies. And then our Office of Science Policy spent a fair amount of time going through all of them and synthesizing a response. And so that response led to a formal policy which was released in the Federal Register in September of 2016, so a little over a year ago. This is entitled Clinical Trials Registration and Results Information Submission. This is a long document. Big chunk of the document deals with the comments that were received and the response of the agency to those comments, and then there's the actual policy itself. So in this document, it says, a fundamental premise of all NIH-funded research is that the results must be disseminated. In research involving human beings, scientists have an ethical obligation to ensure that the burden and risk that volunteers assume comes to something, at the very least by ensuring that others are aware of the study and that its findings contribute to the body of generalizable scientific knowledge. So ensuring that others are aware of the study, that means registration. And that the findings contribute to the body of generalizable scientific knowledge, that means that the results get posted. This is released then. And a lot of publicity went along with this. Francis, Kathy, and I posted another essay in JAMA toward a new era of trust and transparency in clinical trials. Deborah Zarin posted on the exact same day an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that went into details on the final rule of trial dissemination. Much of that was focused on FDA-regulated trials, but there was mentioned in there that all NIH trials would be subjected to the policy. Kathy Wallenetz, who was the director of the Office of Science Policy, and I posted a blog. And there's been a lot of publicity since then. But we made no secret of this. We had been very open up until that point about the things we were thinking about, and then we posted this as well. Okay, so we get some pushback on it, and that pushback has been particularly vocal over the last few months. And by the way, we get pushback on a lot of things, and generally the general theme is it's a great idea, the goals are absolutely laudable, but it shouldn't apply to me. And as long as whatever you're doing doesn't apply to me, you should absolutely go ahead and do it. It's kind of like taxation, which I guess is a hot topic in the news right now. So there's an old, I think it was Senator Huey Long who said, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree." So this is a similar kind of thing. So we heard when we put out the proposed rule, there were folks who said it shouldn't apply to me. It shouldn't apply to trials that are not phase 2 or phase 3 trials, that are not efficacy trials or phase 4 effectiveness trials. It shouldn't apply to small trials. It shouldn't apply to trials that are primarily interested in focusing on safety or exploration of biological mechanisms. It shouldn't apply to trials that don't meet their enrollment targets, which, depending upon how you define that, could be 40% of all trials. So we heard all that, And so we said here, we disagree with commenters who suggested that there is no need for coverage of certain types of trials. So those certain types of trials were the small trials, the exploratory trials, the safety trials, the trials that didn't meet their enrollment targets. The benefits of transparency and the need to fulfill the ethical obligation to participants is as relevant to these types of trials as to any other type. The argument that the agency made was that that the need to register and the need to post results, the ethical need and the transparency need is no different for small trials as it is for big trials. Now, another pushback that we got was that 12 months was too short a period of time. And so we commented on that. We believe that 12 months represents an appropriate balance between investigators' interests and the interest of the public in having access to the results of a publicly funded trial. So, you've got two tensions here. One tension is that, first of all, it takes time to analyze your results and put together a set of tables and figures that you feel comfortable are accurate. Secondly, you want to get your paper published and you want to get it out there. Third, you probably want to write some secondary papers. And then the opposite tension is a year is an awfully long time, and you've been working on this already for many years to put this together. So to ask you to just post summary results within a year seems like a reasonable request from the point of view of the public. And by the way, the journals have made it very clear they don't consider this to be publication. So if it takes longer for a journal to process a paper, that's okay. Yeah.
I feel like you skipped the part that said what are the barriers to people getting their trials published. Like before you implement the solution, what's the problem?
Okay, so what are the barriers? Why are people not publishing? So there are several factors. One is that it takes a long time to get papers published, and it's taking longer. There's literature showing that it's taking longer and longer to get papers published. And we certainly, when we did our study, we heard from a number of investigators who said that they had been trying to get their paper published for years. And first one journal would sit on it for 6 months and then reject it, and then another journal would sit on it for 6 months and reject it, and then another journal. So that's one issue. Now we also know there were about 10% of the studies that we saw, the authors had actually not analyzed their data at all. They had because we asked all the authors, could you tell us the main results of your study? If we can't find the results of your study from your published paper, we'd like to know what the main results were. And there were some who couldn't tell us. We did another follow-up study where we looked to see whether or not we could identify other characteristics of studies that took a very long time to publish. So we knew that hard endpoint studies published faster and multi-center studies published faster. We had one of our folks who had not been involved with the original study go through all the papers, all the published papers that we had to date, and grade those studies as the quality of the clinical trial methods using an accepted method. And what she found was that so the thing was a 9-point scale, if I remember this right, and 25% of the trials scored an 8 or a 9. And those trials published very fast, irrespective of what their budget was. And then there were a bunch of trials that had a lower quality rating, and those trials published a lot more slowly. And so actually I think part of the issue is that some of the trials that we're funding are not very good. And that's probably why they're having trouble getting published. They may be having trouble getting published because journals aren't interested, or maybe because the investigators themselves aren't that interested. And so it's interesting, when we did that, we changed the way we started thinking about making funding decisions on trials, and we actually would sit in a room and ask ourselves an explicit question, which is, can we honestly say that irrespective of what the results of this study will be, that we're interested? And not only that we're interested, but that it will generate interest. And if the answer to that is yes, then let's keep working on this. And if the answer to that is no, then let's look at the next one. Yeah?
Just to follow on that, usually for systemic problems, we suggest that the publish inside academic centers that promote publication. So if it's 70% non-publication, then the system is adapted not to publish.
Yeah.
So these are, so you're talking about the quality of the studies, but you're not talking about what is there at the institution. That makes it hard.
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind, like every small study, every phase is brand new. You know, you've done a protocol and text, you put it away, then you get data, you forgot what the study was, or you remember the skip. There are things that you might imagine speeding up maybe the pipeline. So these don't address those internal issues.
Yeah. Part of the idea of so we got into an interesting debate as to whether or not in our policy we should include publication in a peer-reviewed setting, and decided not to go down that route. And then all we were asking for was posting on clinicaltrials.gov. So posting on clinicaltrials.gov, I know is not the easiest thing in the world, but we're not going to make a judgment as to whether or not this is scientifically interesting. So it was actually interesting to me. Before one of the talks that I gave on this, my boss said to me, can you find a good example of a failed study that got posted on clinicaltrials.gov? So it turned out it took me about 2 minutes to find one. It didn't take long. And what I found was it was a NIAID-funded study where they were looking at some kind of experimental reagent for cat allergy. So I was interested in that because I'm very allergic to cats. Anyway, it was all wrong. The reagent wasn't having the effect that they thought it was supposed to have, and they figured this out after 4 patients. So they posted the result, and actually the result, what they posted was fairly detailed. And then there was a little discussion, it was a brief paragraph about why they thought this wasn't working right. And, you know, I presented this, I said, this is a really nice example. This will not get published in the New England Journal of Medicine. In fact, it may not get published anywhere. But this is interesting, and hopefully somebody else who will have the same bright idea will find this, and then we'll do one of 2 things, decide not to do it, or call up the folks who did that study and say, well, what did you do? So, you know, maybe we'll do it differently, and maybe we'll get a better outcome. So I think part of the thinking here is that we're effectively bypassing journals and saying we have our own place where you post the results. Yeah.
In the study you were talking about barriers, did they look at whether the results of the trial were null? Or?
Yeah. So we did do. This was one thing that the editors at New England wanted us to do, and so of course. Looking at the article, the papers that were published, that was relatively easy. Although sometimes it actually wasn't, because some people don't put in their paper what their primary endpoint is, and so then you're sort of scratching your head, saying, "Well, was this a positive study or not?" But all right, putting that aside, the hard part was finding out the results of the studies that were not published, and so we had to contact the individual authors, PIs, to find that out. So what we did find was that there was a modest effect consistent with prior literature. Positive studies do get published faster than negative studies. Although it was modest, it was not a particularly powerful predictor. And also what's interesting is that among our most highly cited trials, most of them were negative, and most of them were trials that the results were contrary to the original hypothesis of the PIs. And you know, what these are like the big trials that appear in New England JAMA that say XYZ does not work, and you know we tested this in a sample size of 10,000 or 20,000 people, and that's interesting. Okay. All right, so there's a fair amount which is going on, and this is a systems, we're trying to address this as a systems issue. So we thought about, okay, how does a trial work that we might fund? Somebody comes up with the idea, there's an application, it gets reviewed, then hopefully it gets funded, then an IRB has to look at it, FDA has to look at it if it is an FDA-regulated study, and then eventually the trial gets done, the patients are enrolled, the data are collected, and the results are reported out. And so at each step along the way, we have implemented various changes to try to get a better handle on what's going on. The item right now that's causing the greatest deal of interest is that we noticed, and others did as well, that many, if not most of the trials that were problematic and that were not having their main results published were coming in through the parent R01 announcement. And they were going to various relatively undifferentiated study sections, or study sections that weren't being asked to think about clinical trial related issues. And so what we have done is we have now a rule that if you submit a clinical trial, it has to go to a specific kind of announcement. That specific kind of announcement also, of course, makes it much easier for us to answer a very simple question like how many trials are we funding? Because then we can link the study directly to the announcement. There's a IRB. We have a single IRB policy that says this is not just applying to trials. This applies to all multi-center human subject studies. That if you have more than one center, then they're using the same protocol. That there has to be one IRB of record that deals with it. We've had a lot of pushback on that one, not from scientists. The pushback has been from university administrators. Scientists think it's a great idea. The FDA review, this of course is optional and for many trials doesn't apply, but there's work going on various templates to make it easier for people to do things, and that's still a work in progress. And then, of course, at the end is the requirement for registration and reporting. And in this way, we're trying to address many of the issues, in particular, the lack of registration and reporting, and the lack of metadata to enable us to function as effective stewards. And I don't know how many of you have seen this, but we're trying to put out as much material as possible to help applicants walk their way through this process. We have a dedicated web team. They've put together, there's a lot of stuff here. There are decision tools, there are videos, there are links to other source documents. There's also a mailbox. So one of the biggest questions is this study that I'm doing a clinical trial? And does it have to be submitted to a clinical trial announcement? And so we have this mailbox, which has been active. And in fact, I'm looking at most of these, at least the ones that are not straightforward, so that way we have some consistency in how the agency is judging them. So I'm looking at about probably 3 or 4 of these every single day. So far, most of the questions that have come in, I said, no, that's epidemiology. So, of course, we want epidemiology to be published too. Maybe you'll invite me back for another seminar on that one. That's another big can of worms. But right now we're just focusing on trials. And here's on the website about the requirements for registering and reporting and what the steps that one has to do to make that happen. So I'm just going to end with this. Fundamentally, coming back to that paper that came out in 2012, where, in fact, one of the letters that we got from Congress used the word accountable and said that the agency was not being accountable. If half of the trials that we're funding are not getting their results published, either at all or in a timely way, then how can we? Where's the accountability? Where's our accountability? And then, of course, where's the accountability of the people that we fund? There's an ethical mandate. We're talking about people. We're doing experiments on people. Effectively, if you think about it, we're taking taxpayer money. We're using taxpayer money to do experiments on people. And if we're doing experiments on people, there's an ethical obligation that in some way that contributes to science. And then that's transparency. That means that when those studies get done, the results get posted. So I got 2 news stories here. One is a government news story. This is an HHS news release, or an NIH news release. HHS and NIH take steps to enhance transparency of clinical trial results. Okay, and then here's another news story. This came out in Vox. A surprising amount of medical research isn't made public. That's dangerous. Okay, now what's the interesting thing about these two news stories are the dates. So this one got posted on November 19th, 2014. That was several years ago. This one got posted on August 1st, 2017. That's just a few months ago. So several years after we say we're enhancing transparency, this thing comes out that says that there's a lot of research that's not being publicized. Now, to be fair, in this story, they do talk about the NIH policies on clinical trials, and they do link to them. And what they say is that NIH is now in the process of implementing these new policies that hopefully will increase the proportion of trials that do have their results reported. And whether or not these policies will work, we don't know. Only time will tell. So thank you very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed the discussion so far. And
I thought you were going to get into it, but then we sort of went sideways, and I know there's too much to cover. But one of the interesting things to me, especially with Pecori's policy, and I'm wondering how they go together, and I know you know about that, is what about lousy research? I mean, so obviously some slips through the cracks, and you started to go there. So people always say, should everything be published? Yes, it should, probably, or some notice. But how do you publicize lousy research that people shouldn't be paying attention to, probably?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Well, ideally, of course, we wouldn't be funding lousy research. And the research that we fund should be of higher quality. And we know that we are funding some lousy research. You're right, this is a little bit of a different conversation, but as an example of one way that we're trying to deal with that, in the clinical, so if somebody's submitting a proposal for a clinical trial, there's now a form that is specific for clinical trials, and one of the items that we ask people to attach is a statistical analysis plan. And we're not asking for a 90-page document, but a brief statistical analysis plan. The idea, of course, and this may seem perfectly obvious, especially to all of you, but there should be a statistical analysis plan. And that should be in the proposal, and the reviewer should look at it. So it's a way of calling attention to this. And actually, if I had my way, we're not quite there yet, but we're talking about this, I would like to have another section that says, justify your sample size. Because we know that there's a huge amount, one of the major causes of lousy research is underpowered research. And so it's a way of saying that we as an agency really care about this. We care about the sample size. And so we care about it so much so that we're asking the applicants to write something about it, and we're asking the reviewers to look at it and make some kind of a judgment. There are several avenues of attack here on lousy research. One, Kay, that I know you're very interested in, Karen, you're very interested in, is premise. I don't know, did you write the paper? Or somebody wrote a paper saying that no trial should ever get done without a systematic review. You wrote the paper? Okay. So one of the things that we're asking for now is just not a systematic review, is just a description of premise. Tell us a little bit about prior literature and the strengths and weaknesses, and where does your study fit within the context of that. The second is the rigor of the scientific design, and in about a week or so, I'm going to present an idea that we would actually have a form. This would not just apply to trials. This would apply also to animal studies, where we say, here's a section on, are you randomizing, and if so, how? Is there blinded allocation? Is there blinded masked review of outcomes? How did you come up with your sample size? What's your data management plan? What are you going to do about missing data? Sort of basic questions. And then another is inclusion of appropriate variables, and there's particular interest in sex as a biological variable, but inclusion of all appropriate biological variables. And then another big area, which doesn't necessarily apply to trials, but I've learned a lot about, is authentication of resources. We know that we have funded studies that have depended upon a certain antibody or a certain cell line that turned out to be wrong, that the antibody was not the antibody. Or the cell line was contaminated, and it was so and that's the reason why the results are basically worthless. And so tell us, how are you going to assure us, and more importantly, how are you going to assure the scientific community that when you said you were working on this antibody, that that's really what it was? So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. Yeah?
So you talked about accountability of institutions and funding agencies, maybe denying funding in the future for cases where publication wasn't done. And then you also talked about the ethical obligations and IRBs. Putting those two ideas together, are you aware of IRBs that are maybe trying to make accountable individual researchers who have a bad track record in this area because it hurts the institution as a whole and it's unethical to deny them IRB approval if they have a bad track record of publication?
That's a very interesting question. So I spent 14 years of my life on the Cleveland Clinic IRBs, one of the busiest IRBs in the country, including for 10 years I was their first vice chair. And I do remember we talked about that. One of the problems, of course, that all committees face, and IRBs are no exception, is mission creep. And you start getting into areas that potentially that are important. We're not saying that that's not important, but potentially go beyond the sphere of the IRB. So I mean that's an interesting question. The IRB's primary responsibility is to make sure that there's an appropriate risk-benefit considerations for research participants, and also that informed consent is being appropriately managed, and that the study is being appropriately managed from a patient protection point of view. Whether it goes that far, I mean, you could argue that there's no benefit to research participants if the results don't get published. Whether it goes that far, that is an interesting question. Yeah.
So So I chair one of the IRBs here, and we've been having this discussion.
Okay.
And and it's been this kind of how much more burden do we put on faculty versus sort of the ethical obligations and how to actually do it and implement it, because it's something that happens after the trial is done, right, in terms of implementing. But one of the things we have talked about is some sort of going back to the PIs to at least ask about whether they've put the data on the results on clinicaltrials.gov. Because as you mentioned, there's so many issues with publication, but there's really no excuse for not putting that stuff up on clinicaltrials.gov, as long as the journals don't then say you can't publish because you've now put it up there.
That's a great idea, and it gets at your question. That would be something, if you do that, that is a great way to send a message and to create a culture of accountability. To do something like that would be relatively simple. I know it's not simple, but it would be relatively simple and would go a long way. I heard about one IRB that a number of years ago, what they did, they set up some kind of a system so that every time that a paper published from a PI in their institution, they would look to see, they had some kind of a IT system where they would look to see whether or not that paper matched with an IRB protocol. And then what they would do, in most cases, they would find one, and they would send an email to the PI saying, oh, congratulations, this is great. And then now a few times they would not find the match. So they would say, we saw that you published a paper, blah, blah, blah. Can you just tell us which IRB protocol that matches to? And then most of the time they would say, oh, it matches to that one. Okay, great, congratulations. And then there were a few times that they actually found studies that were done without IRB approval. The most important part of it, the most important part were the 99% where they found the link. Because if I'm a PI and I get a note from the chair of my IRB that says congratulations on your paper, that sends a culture of human subjects protection. That's a great way to create that culture. It's 2 seconds of my day. Obviously, it's a lot of work to set a system like that up, but that's a very concrete way of doing that. Yeah.
I hadn't seen this template that you posted on the website, which is really quite impressive. In following an IRB, we often find that the IRB application is the only place where the system has an opportunity for decisions for informing or actually helping. And I was wondering if you're thinking about how to use this template as an opportunity as well. Don't just give me the data, but maybe give me some help about this. Now, most of what you ask us to type in is free text, which can be processed. But I just was wondering if you're thinking about that ecology and helping people put together better protocols.
Yeah.
That you can use.
So great. So a couple of things that are happening. One is that we funded a project called the NIH Collaboratory. This is a common fund project that focused on pragmatic trials. They've put together something called a living textbook on how to do pragmatic trials. It is terrific. And so we're now, it's now reached the point of maturity that we're trying to think of ways in which we can really market it so that people know that it's there. There are resources that are there, they're free, and they're useful. We have another person who works for us, David Murray, who has an extensive background doing group randomized trials, cluster trials, and he has actually posted a, I don't want to call it guidance document, but great stuff on how to do cluster trials. There's a sample size calculation tool, and so we're marketing that as well. And we see this as the beginning of potentially something much bigger, but that's a really good point. Yeah?
So the important thing here is to make results public one way or another. I mean, publishing is not the only way because there are many obstacles like sample size, hard outcome, and like multi-center trials. So I mean, posting in clinicaltrials.gov is a way to go. But the problem is that the trials have been their results posted on clinicaltrials.gov. Sometimes we cannot tell the quality of the trials because the information there is not enough for us to tell. For example, there's no information in sample size calculation or how to deal with missing data.
Yeah, no, you're right, and so in a way, this of course is what we see as a major function of journals is to help with that. But I think the point that you make is very good. So right now we're just hoping to get stuff up there, but you're right that as time goes on and we potentially make this better, we can do this kind of thing. We're working with the Center for Open Science, and they have developed some platforms. We were talking about this. For electronic laboratory notebooks, the equivalent of electronic laboratory notebooks. I think it would be really kind of cool to be able to figure out ways in which we could take what's in an electronic laboratory notebook and make that more public. There's a group that's doing Zika research at the University of Wisconsin. It's non-human primate research. And their electronic laboratory notebook is public. And not only is it public, but it's almost in real time. So you can go onto they have a laboratory website. You can go onto their website and see what experiments they're doing today, or what experiments they did yesterday and what results they got. So that's about as transparent as can be. And that means that when their experiments bomb, it's there for everybody to see. That is, they're way ahead of everybody else, but maybe someday we'll get there.
I know everybody has probably more questions, and I think that Dr. Lauer is able to stay for a while if people have questions, but I wanted to take the opportunity now to thank him while people are needing to leave. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.